Hello and welcome to class number 1 of What is Inner Child Work? I also would like to share with you where the origin of inner child work comes from, as well as share with you how not everybody's inner child is wounded and help you understand why integrating your inner child as adult is really so essential and important for all of us. So inner child work really arose out of therapeutic concept where psychologists and therapists and mental health professions started to witness that wounded trauma, traumatic experiences, any kind of unresolved wounded issues in childhood will often, for a lot of people, resurface in adulthood if they're not properly healed. And oftentimes, when they would resurface, what would happen is an adult would sink into childlike behavior. In other words, will regress back to the childlike state. This is why sometimes we will witness ourselves or adults in our lives acting as if they're having a temper tantrum, acting as if they are little kids, acting as if they're little children when things get very, very difficult in their lives. It could be possibly what's happening is that whatever has triggered their emotional state at that point is connected to a childhood wound, and therefore they automatically regress to that state. And weirdly, we tend to observe them in the childlike state. I think all of us, one way or another, have been there. I myself, for sure, and I definitely have witnessed adults many, many times to regress to the state where we look at them and think, "Oh my goodness, you look like a kiddo right now having a temper tantrum." This is where the inner child work arose from. It really initially was very strongly connected to wounded childhood, to any unresolved trauma. And as you can see, it was incredibly important and still is very important to work on those inner child wounds so that as adults, we don't sink into those childlike behaviors during the times when emotionally things get very difficult, so that we can stay afloat and act like adults and navigate life as adults versus sinking into a childlike behavior. As inner child work has evolved, it has expanded beyond that. At least my understanding of it has definitely expanded, not just into healing our inner child, but also the importance of exploring. And one of the reasons why it's so important to explore your inner child, and in your guidebook, you will see that there's a specific domain set of questions just to exploring your inner child, is because as adults, when we grow up, we often lose touch with that inner childlike part of us. And that inner childlike part of us, and I'm not talking about the part of us that is wounded as a child, but that inner childlike part of us that is not afraid to explore, and that part of us that wants to create and feels comfortable coloring outside of the lines and doesn't really care what anybody thinks. Think back into your childhood. Think about yourself as a child. Think about how much more freedom you had. Think how um, you were not really bound by societal constraints. You were not bound yet by societal rules or any kind of environmental rules. You were just a child having fun. There were no such thing as rules, really, except for when parents say yes or no. I think those were primarily the rules for a lot of us as children. So it's really important to explore and to reconnect that part of ourselves. And then later integrate. This is why you have also questions on integration, because when you integrate your childlike self into your life now as adults, you become more whole. And the reason why you want to be more whole is because the inner child is an archetype. It's an archetype of wonder and play and freedom and creativity and fun and joy. Again, think about children, right? When we think about children, we start smiling because when we think about children, we're thinking about, at least for me, when I think about a child, I immediately imagine a child on a playground or out in the field and running free and exploring and having fun and not being afraid to dress up and look silly and not being afraid to draw and create because the child doesn't think this looks silly or I'm perfectionistic and I need to control this. That's us adults. So, inner child carries that archetype of benevolence and expansion of space. And of course, just like anything else in life, it has a polarity of shadow. The shadow part of the inner child is the really end of that spectrum. So if the inner child as an archetype is this very, very young childlike state, the shadow side would be a very elder, um, think about grandma, grandpa, much, much older state. And now I'm using this as an archetype specifically as a spectrum to inner child because as we all know, a lot of elders are incredibly wise, and being an elder carries its own archetype. But in a contrast to polarity, across from a childlike state, what we're looking at as a shadow self is a juxtaposition where a person acts now too rigid, opposite of playfulness and expansion of freedom. And what the too rigid looks like is too controlling, trying to control its environment and everything around it in its environment. We're also looking at constrictions. We're looking at absence of joy. We're looking at being too serious, looking life through the lens of only what we perceive as this realistic, this is prudent versus a lens of wonder and joy. So as you can think about inner child as an archetype of all of the joy and pleasure and fun and freedom, think about what would be the other split side, the extreme of that would be the shadow side of inner child. And a lot of us tend to really get toward this end of a spectrum as we get adults. For example, I know for me, and I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, sometimes I have a hard time drawing. Sometimes I have a hard time painting because get so wrapped up in my headspace about not getting it right, about not being good enough about it, about making a mess. Now, this is very controlling, as you can see, shadow side of my inner child. And if I only was more connected to my inner child, I would be more free to create. And that's just one example. Inner child, both as a spectrum between the light side and the shadow side, shows up in all of our lives. There's tons of examples all of us have of our lives when we are very restricted and when we are very expensive. The goal is to be somewhere in the middle as adults, where you integrate aspects and you're not so childlike, right? You're not so taken on the archetype of inner child, where as adult, you're so carefree. You disregard responsibilities, you disregard things you are accountable for, you disregard things that you really need to be taken care of. Because as adults, we can't just be kids, we're not kids anymore. Um, we can't just disregard now things that we need to do, which we call adulting, in order to survive. And we certainly can't always throw a temper tantrum when we don't feel good. We need to learn how to self-soothe. We need to learn how to self-regulate ourselves. And so this fight becomes so, so important, not to be always in here nor here where you're so rigid, but to be in the middle. Middle will look like being able to have an integration of both sides where you allow yourself freedom to play, you allow yourself freedom to explore, but you also have boundaries and parameters coming from this side. I don't want to say they're parameters of control, but there are more parameters of having a play now being set up in a playground, which is now the playground is a world. The playground now is your life. So this fight becomes really, really important. And like I said early in the introduction, when it comes to especially wounding in inner childhood, not everybody carries a wounded inner child. Yes, we all experience trauma, and it's impossible, in my opinion, to go through life without sustaining trauma. Trauma varies to a degree and to severity and to a duration. All of those things um, will really fit into how much trauma has affected you. Not to mention, not that people go through the same trauma in the same way, so it's very subjective experience. But a lot of us have had traumatic incidences as children, and they were maybe minor enough where they haven't really affected our development. Or maybe they're so minor where we're able to heal naturally and move away from it, or not even heal. Remember, not all wounds need to be healed, but they're not something that tends to cause us triggering or tends to cause us emotional upheaval. And then, of course, there are, for a lot of people, childhood traumatic wounds that are incredibly traumatic. Um, People experience anything from severity of, unfortunately, childhood sexual abuse to neglect to malnourishment to psychological and emotional abuse to physical abuse. Those things will carry a lot more deeper sense of trauma. And I know that a lot of you who are watching already have this. And my heart really goes out to you because no child should ever experience that level of trauma from an adult, and especially from an adult they trust. As we know, a lot of childhood trauma, unfortunately, is caused by people in the proximity who are caretakers, parents, yes, horrific parents, step parents, caregivers, babysitters, school teachers. Um, Clergy, people that we tend to trust. And so that trust can be really broken. And so as adults, it's hard to heal the trauma because you carry that with you. And it has such an early origin that to heal it can take quite a bit of work. And healing it can be very painful. If you're watching this and you're taking this class, you may already know just intuitively um, whether you do have wounded inner child. Some of you, without even intuition, you just know you have it because you have a history of things happening to you. Some of you um, may not have a history of the severe type of childhood trauma. And so I want to, for those of you who feel like you don't have that history, I want to encourage you not to assume that your inner child then is wounded because you have heard inner child work being very synonymous with inner child healing. Again, not every inner child is wounded. I am one of those people where I don't think I have a wounded inner child. Have I had trauma as a child? Yes, of course I do. Um, was the trauma enough where I feel like I have the wound that needs to heal from childhood? No. So my inner child is more stifled, where I need to really connect with it so I'm not so controlling and anal and restrictive, where I can really open and broaden myself up. So please keep that in mind as you go through this class. There's a reason why I have divided, and in lesson 3, you will see where I'll share why I have divided questions into 3 domains, because I want to help people in all different areas to explore their inner child and to also understand how to integrate it, and to also, if there is healing needs to be done, there's questions for that as well. So I'm really, really excited about this class. I'm trying to think now if there's anything else I wanted to share with you about inner child work. This particular class has an extra spread on self-care. This work, especially if you're doing it in regards to healing your inner child, do not doubtfully involve self-care. Self-care is going to be very, very crucial to you if you're healing your inner child. There's a spread for that. The spread is also going to help you see whether you're done with healing, because you know what, sometimes we do the healing work and we have a hard time finding out whether we are ready to move away from this, whether the wound has been healed and closed. So there is a spread for that as well. But you know, self-care I would encourage for all of us, because if you are exploring and integrating your inner child and you are maybe like me, who are tend to be more rigid, who tend to, if somebody tells me you acting like a child, you have a childlike demeanor, I get a little bit defensive. That's the shadow part of me that comes up. Um, Self-care is going to be also essential, because as you integrate and you get to the middle of the polarity, it's going to really important, because resistances are going to come up, lots of things are going to come up. I hope you're going to have a ton of fun with this class. This is all about having fun. And in the next lesson, I'm going to share with you a ton of wonderful decks and criteria how to find those decks if you have a tarot collection. And in lesson number 3, don't skip that lesson 2, I will share with you how to best take advantage of this guidebook. So I'm really excited you're here, and I will see you in lesson number 2.